Right, good afternoon. Can you tell me your name?
My full name is John Michael Watson Badcock. I was born on the 10th of November 1922 in Nazareth in Palestine,
Now, how did you come
which
to
is
be
slightly unusual.
How did you come to be out there?
Right. My father was a gunner in the First World War, and he fought in Allenby's army from Egypt up to Syria to the end of the war, end of that campaign anyway. And having done that, he found himself in Cairo and was the secretary to the Balfour Committee, which decided on the future mandate of Palestine. Having done that, he thought it would be sensible to join the colonial service, which he did, and therefore become part of the mandate, the administration of the mandate in Palestine. His first posting was to Nazareth. It so happens that my grandfather was GOC of Egypt at the time, who had a daughter called Doris, and my father and she got on very well together, and they got married, and they were given a house quarter right on the top of the hill above Nazareth, and I was born on the 10th of November.
Ah.
My mother died 7 days later.
Oh.
In those days, there was no such thing as antibiotics, and she died of septicemia, so my father was left with a 1-week-old baby in a foreign country. It so happened that my grandfather had another daughter called Joan, and she was in India at the time, and she came across from India to look after me on behalf of her sister. She and my father got on very well together, and so they got married. So my stepmother is my aunt. That is the origin of that family.
Okay, and when did you move back to England?
I moved back. I moved back to England 7 years later, when I went to the border to a preparatory school in St Peter's at Seaford, and I then lived with my grandparents, who lived at Finchampstead in Berkshire. And the only time I saw my parents was once a year. They came home on leave in August, and the following August, my summer holidays were spent in going out to Palestine, which took a week, and that in itself is a story.
Wow.
I never saw my parents from 1939 until 1946, because they remained in Palestine and I was serving in Europe.
Really? Okay. So, do you remember the build-up to World War II?
Very well. In 1939, I was out in August on holiday with my parents, in other words, 8 weeks, a school holiday.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I had to leave a week before in order to be back at school on the right day. My parents were a bit worried about my going back the usual way, which was by boat from Port Said back to wherever it is, Southampton, because the outbreak of war looked fairly imminent at the time, and they thought it would probably be better if they flew me home. So I took off from, it's the only time I've flown below sea level. Not many people have, I think. This was in the days of the old flying boats, the Imperial Airways flying boats, and they landed on on the Sea of Galilee, which of course is 700 feet below sea level, and then flew to Cairo, Brindisi, Bordeaux, England. So I came back that way. The opening of the war, I was by this time at Sherborne at school, and I was a boy at Sherborne from 1936 onwards, actually, but in 1939 war broke out. And life changed a bit with rationing, ration books and sparse clothing and all that sort of thing. we were bombed at Sherman. I remember the sirens going, and we had to be in the cloisters underneath the chapel. And one of the bombs dropped about as far away as that bottom of the fence down there, and the whole of the building shook and so on. But for a boy of 16 or 17 was quite exciting. And we all said, oh, hooray, of course the school will close down, we'll all go. Not a bit of it. We had to grind on and so on. At that time, I was in the OTC, Officer Training Corps, which most people were, and I was a drummer boy in the band. I found that, as such, of course, you had a very good idea of tempo and beat. All my forebears, including my grandfather, were Indian Army, Gurkhas or something like that, and I think my grandfather expected me to join the Gurkhas. I had no such intention because I would only be known as so-and-so's son or so-and-so's grandson. I wanted to carve my own way in life. So I was going to go up to Cambridge, Corpus Christi College, to read engineering. Then, of course, when the war broke out, things changed a bit. And they closed Sandhurst, and the army introduced a new system, which was that they were very short of technical officers for the sappers, signals, and reaming. And the idea was that you took an exam, if you passed, you were taken in, trained as a soldier, and you were then sent up to one of the universities for 6 months. In our case, our signals to read electronic engineering. So I left Sherman thinking that what regiment should I join? And since I was a drummer, it was a good idea of Morse, da-da-da-da-da-da. I also found that it was a signal platoon, and we had a number 1 set. That won't mean anything to you, except that it was a wireless set that normally lived on the back of a mule in India. And that was the communications for the school OTC. So I knew something about signalling for having been a drummer, also part of the signal platoon. So I joined Royal Signals, which is how I came to be. I joined up, I wasn't called up, went to Catterick, Signal and Badcock, and then with about another 60 other similar people, we were put onto the reserve and sent up to Oxford. In my case, I went to Worcester College, Oxford, where we had 6 months of pretty concentrated teaching on electronic engineering. Stop me if you want me to.
No, carry on, please.
All right? Prattling on.
No, it's absolutely fine.
So one lived a pretty normal undergraduate life, except that the university realised that we had already been trained to a certain extent in military affairs, and they were short of fire wardens. So at night we were told that we would, 2 of us would be on duty as air raid wardens in the laboratories, which was fine. So we enjoyed our life up there. I rode for Oxford and various other things and so on. But all of a sudden, one of our undergraduates was sent down. And this caused absolute mayhem because, of course, we'd been fairly relaxed ourselves about life. But the fact that one of us was, that we were doing this air raid warden, one bright chap went to the professor's desk, our professor in the college at night, and found that he had a little black book with all our names on it. And beside each name, there were little dots in pencils. The person who'd been sent down had 3 black dots. The number of people who volunteered for night duty increased immensely because we all then went to the book. If we had two, we rubbed the last one out. And he must have been one of those forgetful professors who couldn't remember what he'd written in his book or something. Nobody else was sent down. Life returned to normal. We all thoroughly enjoyed ourselves. At the end of the 6 months, I then went to an OCTU, the Officer Cadet Training Unit, where I was trained to become an officer.
Where was that?
And I appeared as a second lieutenant in due course.
Where was the officer?
The OCTU was at Aldershot. And pretty tough on the whole in its day. And from there, one started one's army life proper. Shall we have a break there, just one?
Yeah. So, where are we now? What year are we in?
Well, now it's 1941. 1941. I was commissioned in February 1941.
Mm-hmm.
I was commissioned.
So you were conscripted, or you? Yes.
No, I was about.
You was volunteer.
I was a war service officer.
War service.
In other words, I hadn't actually been called up. I had volunteered to come in. So anyway, I was a war service officer.
Okay.
Not a regular or anything like that. My own intention was to serve on, if I could. I wanted to make it my career.
All right. Okay. So, what was your training like?
Well, the officer training at OCTU was the same as Sandhurst these days, but much shorter, only 6 months. And one was trained, you did just about everything that an officer was supposed to do, the same as you do at Sandhurst these days. I was one of 20 people. I think I was the youngest in that group of 20. I was, 19, 20 or something like that. Most of the others were rather older. Anyway, I survived that. Two of my intake were dismissed. They were both young and couldn't stand the pace, I think. Anyway, I was commissioned from there and found myself posted as a Royal Signals officer to a 35 tank brigade in Penrith, in Cumbria, which was a bit of a surprise. I wonder what a tank brigade was doing in Cumbria. And this brigade was an armoured brigade, 35 tank brigade, unusual. It had one tank regiment, one RTR, Royal Tank Regiment, and two Durham Light Infantry battalions who had been converted or were converting to become armoured, in other words, fighting in tanks. This was an experimental brigade. The idea was that they would be armed, the brigade would be armed with tanks, and instead of having a gun on the turret, it would have a searchlight. The turret was constructed in such a way that instead of the gun, there was a vertical slit. Behind the vertical slit was an arc lamp with the power supply from the engine. When the arc lamp was lit, it shone onto a steel plate, a very highly polished steel plate. And from there, it was reflected out through the slit. So the net result was, if you were looking down on it from above, there'd be a tank with an arc of light in front. The idea being, A, to light the way forward, B, to blind the enemy, But it also caused a converse triangle in the dark, an umbra. And in that dark area would be infantry, sappers picking up mines, which couldn't be seen from or by the enemy because they'd be blinded. But my role there in the signal platoon as a lieutenant in the signal squadron was we were refitting all the tanks and training all the armoured personnel in communications, because part of the system was that all the lights must come on and go off at the same time, and secondly, no one tank must illuminate another. So there was a very strict procedure for moving forward, and this was practiced up on the just outside Lowther Castle in Cumbria. Of course, the reason for it is just about on the limit of where German reconnaissance planes could fly over to see what was going on. How many spies there were amongst the civilians, I don't know, because it was a pretty unusual sight. All they saw was the sky lighting up and going off every now and again, lighting up, going off, clouds or whatever. And they all wondered a bit, I think, they must have all wondered what the hell was going on. Inevitably, many of them found out, of course. But the whole idea was that it should be processed and then used. Initially, we were going to go out to Africa. But when the war out there began to go our way, we then became involved in, of course, the landings on the north coast of France. In the signals, we then trained not only for all the lights to come on and go off together, that was the purpose of it, but then we said, or the authorities said, right, the human eye subtains, will picture for, I can't remember what it is, so much of a second. It's rather like a flutter. If you turn the lights on and off just short of that, you actually blind the individual. The eye can't take this sudden flash on, off, just as it's losing the sight of the first one. And it can be quite painful. So this added to the blinding of the enemy. But the art of it was, of course, to get the whole, if it was a regimental advance, get every tank to come on and go off at the same time. So it was quite in those days you didn't have software and things like that to do it. It had to be done by a person actually turning it on and off over the radios.
So they were taken to France, you say?
Sorry?
They were used in France?
Well, that was the idea, that it would be for the landings. Mm-hmm. However, life up there, there were three of us in the squadron. There was a major who had a wife, and he found lodging somewhere where he and his wife could live, which left a captain, bachelor, and myself likewise, to have accommodation. And it so happened that our squadron was located in Greystoke Castle. Now, that won't mean anything. Do you know it, Anton? Well, Greystoke Castle.
Yes.
The conditions on all the men were in nissen huts in the grounds of Greystoke Castle. The actual castle itself, the owners had said officers only, and so Gordon Nettleton and I lived inside the castle, which was enormous, very cold, no heating, riddled with dry rot. So we selected one bedroom, which was enormous and high ceiling, and we put up our camp beds in there. But we did enjoy dining in the banqueting hall at a 6-foot table on compo rations, as it was. So our life up there was great fun, actually, in many ways. And we used to, do motorcycle training all over the Cumberland Hills. We must have climbed Hell Belling God knows how many times and so on, getting soldiers fit and so on. One knew the area quite well by the time we finished. However, the war moved on, and of course Africa was no longer a war theatre, and so the brigade was disbanded because they reckoned that there wouldn't be a use for this system, in the landings, which was a great pity. The second thing was that they couldn't afford to keep it going. In terms of the number of tanks which were involved, they wanted armour for everything else. And at this time, 79th Armoured Division was born, so to speak, and it was tasked with all the funnies, quote, unfunny, all the funny armour, all the special tanks, the tanks that floated, the tanks that carried flamethrowers, the tanks that carried fascines for filling in ditches, bulldozers, the kangaroos and so on. They all had these funny names like crabs and so on. And this was what we did, or what 79th Armoured Division, they took over pretty well the whole of Suffolk. All the civilians were removed, or the only people allowed in there were the farmers. And on those, all the replicas of all the defences of Europe were built. All the German defences on the north coast were built. The idea was that all these special machineries would be developed in such a way that they'd be able to overcome the German defences. So I was then moved down to Saxmundham in Suffolk, into 7th and 9th Armoured Division or Signal Regiment. When I arrived, it was sort of 44. D-Day was beginning to loom, all these highly modified armour were located in many different places and included American, Canadian armoured regiments as well, all trained in various places, from somewhere up in Scotland, down in Linehead in Wales, and down in Portsmouth and Southampton. So the division had to develop them, train them, equip them, and do the research required as to what they could do and couldn't do. And the divisional commander was a person called Major General Hobart, Percy Hobart, who was actually a retired Major General, but he was an expert in armour. And they made him the GOC, General Officer Commanding, of this of the division. And he would travel 1,000 miles a week, possibly, moving from one site where they were doing training of this or that and so on. And the nearer D-Day became, of course, the more concentrated was all of these affairs. And it was decided that what would happen, it wouldn't go as the division itself. All the components, its various parts, would be attached to assault groups up and down the coast. The Americans would have their DD tanks and so on, the Canadian area and the British area and so on would all have their own slice of 79th Armoured Division under command to help them get into and fight on in BAR. therefore the divisional headquarters itself would not go probably in the first month or so into Germany. But the divisional commander and his immediate staff officers and so on would have to be there because he insisted on being somewhere close to where he could advise on how these various troops should be used and maintained. And so he formed what was called a tactical headquarters. And that had to have its own communications, obviously. And I was selected by my CEO as a lieutenant to command the signals element of this tactical headquarters. My CEO was a person called Lieutenant Colonel John Athill, who had been fighting in the desert, badly wounded, had been invalided home, had a slice of metal let into his skull, and he was a bachelor, very strict. His predecessor had been sacked by the general anyway, and he had an uncanny thing. He smoked a pipe. He had 7 pipes and smoked one every day. And when he got agitated or things weren't going his way, he would bite great chunks off the stems of his pipes. It was a most peculiar thing. But one feared him and respected him. Somehow I managed to get on with him, and I survived. Anyway, we eventually, our turn came. We were put down, stationed in Horsham, at that time when doodlebugs were flying over. There was one evening we were all stationed in a house in Horsham, and if you could get things like eggs and so on from local farmers, you could have them for breakfast, and they went on the ration. And somehow we'd got hold, Jimmy Hummel and I had got hold of half a dozen eggs, and they were we'd shoved them on the windowsill for what it was worth. And one of these damn V1s went off, V2s went off, and bust all the windows. It broke our 6 eggs. But that was quite new. You could hear them coming. Bum, 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 bum. If you could still hear them, you knew you were safe. But as soon as they stopped, as soon as that sound stopped, and the motor cut off and it came down, they weren't terribly accurate, so it was, but they were aimed at London and various other places like that. Anyway, eventually we arrived in France and Germany. I landed at Greystoke. But that in itself was peculiar because in 1939 my French wasn't too good at school, and my mother came home on her own, and she said, "I'm going to take you on a holiday in France, and we're going to go and stay with the French family, and there will be no English spoken, and we shall stay with them for 4 weeks, and this will improve your French." So we travelled over this just before the war started. Travelled over in the Queen Mary to overnight to
Boulogne?
Cherbourg,
Oh, sure.
and then went to this little village on the north coast in Normandy called Ouistreham, where we lived with, would you believe it, my name is Badcock, as you know, we lived with Monsieur et Madame Lecoq. They were a lovely family in a 2-storied building. My mother and I hired bicycles, and we bicycled all over Normandy, up the canals to Bayeux and round about the place and so on. And I took a lot of photographs, and that was the end of the holidays in 39. To my surprise, there I was. No, in the end of 44, the public was asked, anybody got any photographs of north coast of Europe? And I'd taken a whole lot. I still am, as you can see from that up there, a very keen photographer. Only I had a miniature camera. I got photographs of the canal, the bridge, over the canal and things like that. And I thought, they'll never want to see my photographs. They're useless. There I was, landing there at the same place that I'd been. Anyway, it was pretty unpleasant out there that we were subject to air raids and all the rest of it and so on. Our job was to maintain communications for the GOC with all the various operations that were going on. And so I found myself going back to break out by the Falaise Gap, which was an experience in itself, very unpleasant. We were down in December 1944 when the Germans launched a surprise attack on the Americans. How are you doing?
Yep.
Surprise attack on the Americans. We had to go down because some of our armour, specialised sort of armour, went down there, and so I had to provide the communications and so on for that. Wartime Island with the Canadians going up through the Scheldt. The attack on Boulogne, 1,000 bomber raid on Boulogne, which I watched from where the present supermarket is, looking down over the harbour, and so on. So I found myself in all the sort of places where there was action. And we moved up all the way through Normandy, following the advance up through Arnhem, and then, to cut a long story short, we found ourselves up on the Elbe, and it so happened our headquarters was only half a mile away from where Monty had his headquarters. And I happened to go over because I was involved in some communicating on the morning that von Rundstedt appeared outside Montgomery's caravan to go conduct the armistice arrangements. From then on, of course, the armistice came. I, by this time, had already applied for a regular commission, which I then got, came back to England, and that was the end of my war service. After that is history.
So,
now then, you've got
well, yes, I've got a few questions. So what was your overall feeling about your experience of the war, if you could sum it up in one or two
like
words?
any young man at the time, I mean, when our brigade was disbanded, we were mortified because we'd all hoped that we were on the cusp of going out to Africa and this, finishing off Rommel in Africa and that sort of thing. So it was daily. It was exciting. You lived your own life with your friends and your pals and all that sort of thing. I mean, when we were up in Penrith, we formed because there was no such things as, entertainments and that sort of, most places were closed down, you couldn't have lights at night anywhere and all that sort of thing. So we formed our own concert party, and we used to go around we called ourselves the Black Berries. And we go to village halls around the area and put on a concert for the locals and that sort of thing. We enjoyed ourselves, they seemed to enjoy it as well. And in those days, actually, it was very funny. We lived, as I said, in Greystoke, so, and Gordon Nettleton was a bit of a roue, really. He had a girlfriend on the side, I think, somewhere. In fact, I know he did. And so I was sort of left on my own. The idea in those days was that there'd be dances arranged in the town hall or something like that, and all the girls would appear in the town hall, and you got always in uniform. We weren't allowed to be out of uniform. So we went into uniform, and all the girls would be lined up down the side, and you'd come in and you'd select one, hope for the best. So you danced. In those days, things were, the conditions under which boy meets girl were much stricter than I think like today. But I formed quite a relationship with a girl who was great fun and so on. We used to meet when we could, and when I was posted away, that was the end of it, basically. But many, many years later, I was a brigadier, and I was commanding the brigade down here. We had to exercise, our duty then was to exercise battalions who had come back from Germany and various other, amalgamating them. And I organised an exercise on the Isle of Skye. It was to be an amphibious exercise. The battalion was to land helicopters and landing craft and all that sort of thing. I did a recce and all that sort of thing. Anyway, the exercise took place and we went over there. And it's the only time, the second time only that I've appeared in the Daily Mirror. And there was a banner headline at some time in the Daily Mirror saying, "Skye farmers say, what does the sheep? What does the sheep do? Well, it bays, doesn't they?
Bar.
Sorry?
Bar.
Yeah. So it's bar to bring it. And it's about the same. When we were there, my staff officer said, "So there's the post office has just rung up. There's a letter addressed to Brigadier Badcock, Isle of Skye, and they think it must be you. So I've sent somebody to collect it for him." So, but as you can imagine, when this letter arrived, there was much interest in it to see what it said. And inside was a piece of purple paper, and it said, "Dear Brigadier Badcock, I think you must be the Badcock that I knew in Penrith."
Wow. Wow. And how long later was that?
Absolutely amazing, isn't it?
How many years later was that?
Oh, well, this was 1970 something.
Wow. So, what were your day-to-day living accommodations like? Obviously, they were good because you were in
Greystoke
Greystoke.
Castle. But if it wasn't there, I lived with my grandparents.
All right.
Grandpa and grandmother in a house in Finchamstead in Berkshire. That he was an ex-major general, a retired major general. And so we had obviously a military candidate. But in those days, well, actually I had two cousins also lived with them because their father was serving somewhere or other. The three of us used to live with them occasionally. Not all, I was there permanently. They'd come in the holidays sometimes or in term time. And the three of us, our grandparents would say, "Right, we don't want to see you until this evening." So we'd get on our bicycles, we'd cycle off. We'd be very keen on beagling. Oh. You would think nothing of bicycling 12 miles, join the beagles, run round the countryside until the evening, bicycle the 12 miles back again.
So this was before the war?
Sorry?
This was before the war?
This was before and during the war. Well, less during the war, yes. It's just before the war. Up to that time. During the war, I was a home guard. Because when I was at school, I was part of the OTC. In the holidays, I was expected to join the local, because I had a military experience, I was expected to join the local LDV, as it was known, and local defence force, local defence volunteers, which then became the Home Guard. And so I had a rifle which I kept in the house and a tin hat and so on. This was in the holidays, of course, and when I wasn't at school. And my duties were to, I think I did 3 evenings a week, all-night watch from the top of the village church, from Finchley Church, which could see out all the way around.
Which church was this? Where were you? Where were you here?
In Finchley, sorry?
In Berkshire.
Berkshire, yeah. Finchley, Berkshire.
Okay.
Yes, of course, ration books. So you only had 8 ounces of butter a week, whether you were at school or at home. I can't remember what the meat ration was, but it was pretty low, and so on. You'd see searchlights, air raids going on, travel. All the trains would have, there'd be no lights on at night, all blacked out, travelling. Cars would all have shields on the headlights so the beam never went upwards, and so on. I was allowed to drive my grandfather's car, which was very nice. He allowed me to do that. I had my own motorcycle. I bought it for £10, aerial square fall, and things like that, which I took up to Oxford with me, which I wasn't allowed to do, but still I did. What other life? We'd during that time, again, you made your own sports. We used to have mixed hockey. When it froze like it did this last week, we'd play ice hockey on the local ponds and lakes and things. Yeah. But pretty carefree as a young person would be.
Yeah. So when you were in the throes of the action, did you actually lose any comrades or friends?
Killed, shot, yeah. I lost 2, 3 soldiers, and basically during that time. But I think the worst time that I had was we were in the Falaise Gap. That probably doesn't mean much to you, but it was the Germans had got trapped into the northwest portion of France. Americans had surrounded some, and we squeezed them, and there was a little gap. The only path out was through that gap for almost a complete army. In the meantime, because it was so difficult, they got shelled, they got bombed, they got, attacked. Our own troops were constantly. When you went into that area, I think it was the smell. I've never forgotten it. It wasn't just human smells. I mean, you see, bodies all over the place and bits and pieces and the trees and things. But it was the cattle on their backs with all 4 legs standing up, with all their entrails coming out. The smell, it was difficult to bury it a lot. And everywhere there was wonderful German equipment which had been abandoned. They couldn't get it out. So we helped ourselves to German bikes and things like that. But from the point of view of death, one seen quite a bit of it.
So how did you cope with that personally and as an officer?
I think in those days we had a totally different concept, I think. You were told to grin and bear it. You tried never to show one's emotions. There was no question of crying or anything like that. If you did, you were, crybaby. In fact, you were inclined, any soldier that sort of turned that way, you would begin to think, look out, he's on the way. You'd have to try and succour him and that sort of thing. Yeah, I've seen deaths, but then since then I've seen a lot more too.
Right. So you weren't ever wounded yourself, or
No,
no?
fortunately.
So were you married at the time during the war?
No,
No.
I didn't get married till after the war.
And where were you when the war ended? Was that in France?
I was in Germany
In
in the war. VE night was extraordinary. Because of our division commander, he had first of all written the history of the division. He got his staff to write the history of 79 right up to the end of D-Day, of VE Day. And he had it printed by the Germans in Hamburg. And he had a copy for every single man in the division. But that was even the VE Day. Actually, I've got a copy down there. It must be, they're probably worth quite a bit. Now, that night we built a most enormous bonfire. And every single man, again, one of our armoured regiments had find the naval rum store in Hamburg. They confiscated the lot. And again, every man in the division, he wasn't distributed with his own pot, but every unit got a share of the rum. So we had this vast, great bonfire on Lüneburg Heath, and bags of rum. They were all as tight as sticks.
Big party.
That was the conclusion of my army service in Germany.
Oh, fantastic. So how did, so obviously after that you came back to England?
Yeah, I was posted back. By this time I'd become a regular officer. I did a few weeks training. I was put on a boat on VJ Day, victory over Japan, and sailed out to India and Ceylon. And that's where my regular army life went on from there up to 1977.
Oh, right. 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 I think that's more or less it.